24 centimeters a year. That is how fast one slab of the Earth's crust is being shoved beneath another out in the South Pacific, along a boundary most people have never heard of and could not find on a map. It is the fastest, most violent plate boundary on the planet, and over about 30 hours this week it lit up. 6 earthquakes strung like beads on a string across 2,000 kilometers, drawing a line straight down the trench toward New Zealand. And the moment that line appeared, one question spread everywhere. Is something building? Is stress marching toward a country already sitting on a fault that is 300 years overdue? Tonight we answer that, and the truth is stranger, and in one specific way more unsettling than either the panic or the calm. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The line on the map. 6 earthquakes drew a line across the planet in a day and a half. Not a scatter, not a random handful of dots flung across the Pacific. A line. If you'd been watching the map the way I was watching it, late on the night of July 20th into the 21st, you would have seen them arrive one after another, each new marker snapping into place a little further south than the last, until the whole sequence stretched for roughly 2,000 kilometers. That is about 1,700 miles, from the waters near Samoa in the north, past Tonga, and then straight down through the Kermadec Trench, ending just off the top of New Zealand. Beads on a string. That is the phrase that keeps getting used, and it fits, because that is exactly what it looked like. And when you see something like that, your brain does something automatic. It refuses to accept coincidence. A line means intention. A line means a cause pulling everything into order. So the question forms almost before you can stop it. Is something moving down that boundary? Is stress transferring, quake by quake, toward New Zealand? Is this the shape of a warning? Let me give you the honest answer right now up front, because I am not going to make you wait 2 hours to find out whether you should be scared tonight. Based on everything we actually know as of today, this cluster is not a countdown. It is not a fuse burning toward New Zealand. There is no established science that lets anyone look at 6 moderate earthquakes spread across a trench and say the big one is now loading. That method does not exist. Seismologists have hunted for it for decades and come up empty. But that is only half of the answer, and if I stopped there I would be lying to you by leaving out the part that actually matters. Because the fact that these 6 quakes do not predict a disaster does not mean the danger is small. It means the danger was already there, sitting under that water the whole time, whether or not these particular earthquakes ever happened. The line on the map is not the threat. The line is a window, and what it lets you see through it is one of the most violent machines on the surface of this planet, running exactly the way it always runs, on a boundary most people have never heard of and could not find on a map. So that is the real shape of tonight, not a prediction, a revelation. We are going to look straight at what fired off in those 30 hours, and we are going to take it apart piece by piece, and by the time we're done you're going to understand something that almost no headline will tell you. You will understand why a pattern that looks like a warning is not one, and why the thing you should actually be paying attention to is far bigger, far older, and far quieter than 6 dots on a screen. Start with where this happened, because geography is the first clue. The line those earthquakes drew is not random, it traces something. Underneath that stretch of the South Pacific, 2 of the largest pieces of the Earth's outer shell are colliding, and they have been colliding for millions of years. The Pacific Plate, the vast slab of ocean floor that makes up most of the Pacific Basin, is being driven down and under the edge of the Australian Plate. Where one plate dives beneath another, we call it a subduction zone, and this particular one has a name that most of the world has never spoken out loud. The Tonga Kermadec Subduction Zone. It is a seam in the planet, thousands of kilometers long, and it is one segment of the great loop of collision zones and volcanoes that rings the entire Pacific Ocean. You have heard that loop's name even if you have never heard of Tonga Kermadec, the Ring of Fire. Now hold that picture, because it explains the line immediately. If earthquakes happen along a boundary, and that boundary is itself a long narrow seam, then the earthquakes are going to plot as a long narrow shape. They are going to look like a line for the same reason streetlights look like a line down a straight road. The line is the road. It is not evidence that something is travelling down it. That distinction is going to come back over and over tonight, so plant it now. A line up on this map is the expected thing. It would be far stranger to see these quakes scattered in a circle, because there is no fault arranged in a circle here. There is a trench, and a trench is a line, and so its earthquakes fall into a line. The strongest event in the whole sequence hit on the morning of the 21st, a magnitude 5.6 in the Kermadec Islands region. And here is a detail that sharpens everything. The Kermadec Islands are not some neutral patch of open ocean. They are New Zealand territory. So the biggest shock of this cluster did not just point toward New Zealand from a distance. It happened inside New Zealand's own house, at the far northern end of it, on the same plate boundary that runs south, and turns into the faults that could one day level a city. That is why people in New Zealand felt the hair stand up on their arms when they saw this. It was not paranoia, it was proximity. I checked that magnitude 5.6 against the official record, because on a fast-moving story, the first thing you do is confirm the number the whole thing hangs on. The United States Geological Survey logged it on July 21, 2026, at a depth of only about 10 kilometers below the seafloor, shallow, and their impact assessment came back green across the board, meaning no significant damage and no expected loss of life. So the headline event, the one that grabbed everyone, was a real earthquake in a real and dangerous place, but on its own it hurt no one. Hold on to that gap between how it felt and what it did, because that gap is the whole story. Because here is what your instinct is screaming at this point, and it is a good instinct. It is the one that kept your ancestors alive. 6 earthquakes. One line, pointed at a country sitting on a fault that everyone agrees is overdue. Surely that is not a coincidence. Surely that many events, that close together, aimed that precisely, has to mean something is building. That instinct is the reason this video exists. It is also, as we are about to see, exactly the trap that has fooled people for as long as we have been drawing maps of earthquakes. So over the next stretch, I am going to walk you through those 6 events one at a time, because they are not all the same, and the differences between them are the key that unlocks this entire mystery. Then we're going to look at the machine underneath them, the fastest, most violent plate boundary on Earth, and I am going to show you the number that makes your stomach drop when you understand what it means. After that, we deal with the real question, the one everyone in New Zealand is actually asking. Could this reach the Alpine Fault? Could a quake hundreds of miles out at sea wake up something that has been sleeping for 300 years? None of those answers are what you would guess from the map. That is the promise of tonight. Every easy assumption you would make looking at that line of dots is going to turn out to be either wrong or true for a completely different reason than you think. And the one thing that is genuinely worth being afraid of is the one thing the map cannot show you at all. One more thing before we count them, because it matters for how this felt. It was the compression that got people. Not any single quake, but the rhythm of them arriving so close together, one after another, over about 30 hours. If those same 6 earthquakes had been spread out over 6 months, nobody would have blinked. Nobody plots earthquakes that arrive one a month. It was the fact that they came in a tight burst, stacking up on the map while people watched, that made the sequence feel like something with momentum, something moving with purpose toward the south. And that feeling of momentum is precisely the illusion we're going to take apart, because momentum implies a single thing in motion, and what we actually have is several separate things that happen to move at once. The compression in time is real. The momentum is imaginary. Holding those two apart is most of the work of understanding this. So let us start with the beads on the string and count them, because the first surprise is hiding in plain sight, in a single number attached to just one of those 6 earthquakes, a number that tells us these events were never the connected chain they appear to be. Part 2. 6 beats on a string. Let us count them north to south, the way they fall on the map. 6 earthquakes over roughly 30 hours, and I want you to notice something as we go because the differences are going to matter more than the similarities. At the far northern end near Samoa, a magnitude 5.0. This one struck shallow, right up near the top of the boundary, in the upper crust where the 2 plates grind directly against each other. Then, north of Tonga, a magnitude 4.9. Then, further down, near the Kermadec Islands, another magnitude 5.0, again shallow, again at the interface where plate meets plate. South of Fiji, a magnitude 4.6. And then, on the morning of the 21st, the big one, the magnitude 5.6 in the Kermadec region that we already met, the strongest of the group, sitting inside New Zealand territory at the southern reach of the line. There was a sixth marker on the map too, a magnitude 4.8, southwest of Vanuatu. And I want to be careful and honest with you here, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets swept into a scary story when it does not belong there. That Vanuatu event is on a different segment of boundary. It is almost certainly connected to separate activity around Vanuatu, its own aftershock sequence from its own larger earthquake, and it is not part of this Tonga-Kermadec line at all. It shows up on the same regional map simply because the map is big and the Pacific is crowded with plate boundaries. So we are going to set it aside, not because it is not real, but because honesty means not padding the pattern. If I wanted to scare you, I would leave it in and say 7. The truth is it is a different story, and the line we care about is the Tonga-Kermadec one. So the real cluster is those events strung from Samoa down through Tonga, and the Kermadecs to New Zealand's doorstep. And on the surface they look like family. Similar magnitudes, all in the 4s and low 5s, all in the same window of time, all along the same trench. It is the most natural thing in the world to assume they are one connected event, a single stress wave rippling down the boundary, each quake handing off to the next like a line of dominoes falling toward New Zealand. But that assumption falls apart the moment you add one more piece of information to each dot. Not where it happened, how deep. Because earthquakes do not just have a location on a map. They have a location in the third dimension, straight down, and that depth is one of the most revealing things a seismologist can know. And when you pull the depths for these events, the tidy family portrait cracks open. Most of them, the ones near the Kermadecs, the one near Samoa, happen shallow, right at the plate interface in the upper crust, maybe 10 kilometers down, exactly where you would expect a boundary rupture. But that magnitude 4.9 north of Tonga did not. That one happened far deeper, roughly 95 miles down. That is about 114 kilometers, straight into the earth, well below the shallow seam where the plates meet. Stop and sit with what that means, because it is the first real turn in this whole story. An earthquake at 114 kilometers is not happening at the boundary between the two plates. It cannot be. At that depth, the Pacific plate has already dived under, already been swallowed down into the mantle, and it is now cracking inside itself, deep in the throat of the subduction zone. We have a name for that. An intra-slab earthquake. Intra, meaning within. It is the slab breaking internally as it bends and heats and gets dragged downward. And it is a completely different mechanism from a shallow quake, where two plates slip against each other at the surface. So think about what that does to the domino idea. If these earthquakes were one connected rupture travelling down the trench, they would all be happening on the same structure, at roughly the same depth, on the same fault surface. They are not. Some are at the top of the boundary. At least one is 100 kilometers down inside the sinking slab. You cannot have a single wave of stress that is simultaneously skating along the surface and plunging 100 kilometers into the mantle. Those are two different worlds, two different mechanisms, which means these 6 events, however neatly they line up on a flat map, are not one thing. They are several separate things that happen to share a neighbourhood, and that is the point I need you to carry forward, because it is the spine of everything that comes next. The line on the map is real, but the connection your brain wants to draw between the beads is not. When you flatten the Earth onto a screen, you lose the depth, and losing the depth is what makes 6 unrelated ruptures look like a chain reaction marching toward New Zealand. Put the depth back, and the chain dissolves into what it actually is. A very active boundary doing several independent things at once. Now, you might reasonably ask the obvious follow-up. Fine, they are not one connected rupture. But could they all still be aftershocks of something bigger? There was, after all, a genuinely large earthquake near Tonga not long before this, back in March, a magnitude 7.6, big enough to rattle the whole region. Could these 6 just be the long tail of that event, the boundary still ringing months later? It is a fair question, and it is the one we tackle next because the answer involves going back to that March earthquake and looking at something strange about it, something that most of the coverage completely missed. That magnitude 7.6 was not a normal shallow megathrust. It happened at a depth that changes the entire way you have to think about it, and once you understand where it really was, the idea that these July quakes are its aftershocks starts to look very shaky indeed. But before we go there, let me close the loop on why any of this matters, because I do not want you to think we're just doing bookkeeping on a pile of moderate earthquakes. Here is why the depth detail is not a footnote. If you cannot even establish that these 6 events are connected to each other, then the whole premise of the scary version, The premise that stress is marching down the boundary toward New Zealand has already lost its foundation. There is no marching if there is no chain. There is no countdown if there is no clock. What you have instead is a boundary so loaded, so relentlessly active, that it can throw off half a dozen moderate earthquakes across 2,000 kilometers in a day and a half without any of them needing to be talking to each other at all. And that, strangely, is the more unsettling picture. Not a chain reaction, which at least has a logic to it, a beginning and a direction. Just a boundary that is so full of stored energy that this kind of scattered violence is its resting state. It's Tuesday. Because it was in fact a Tuesday, more or less. An ordinary window of time in which one of the most dangerous seams on the planet did something that only looks extraordinary if you do not know what it does on a normal week. It is worth pausing on the trench itself because the shape of the seafloor here tells you how much force is at work. The Kermadec Trench is one of the deepest ocean features on the planet. Its floor plunges to around 10 kilometers below the sea surface at its deepest point, a place called the Horizon Deep, which is among the deepest spots in any ocean, second only to the famous Mariana Trench far to the north. That trench is not carved by erosion the way a canyon is. It is a bend. It is the exact line where the Pacific plate flexes downward and begins its dive beneath the Australian plate, dragged so forcefully into the earth that it pulls the seafloor down into a scar nearly 10 kilometers deep. When you look at where those 6 earthquakes fell, they fell along that scar because the scar is the boundary, and the boundary is where the strain lives. And there is a piece of structure most people never picture. Behind a subduction trench, on the side of the overriding plate, the crust often gets stretched and torn as the whole system deforms, forming what is called a back arc. So this is not a simple two-dimensional line where one plate slides under another. It is a wide, complicated zone with the trench in front, the descending slab plunging beneath, and the stretched crust behind, all of it groaning under the same relentless convergence. That complexity is another reason the 6 earthquakes came from such different places and depths. They were not points on a single fault. They were releases scattered across a broad, tortured system, each one finding its own weak spot in a zone that has thousands of them. So we have counted the beads, and we have found the crack in the string. At least one of these earthquakes is 100 kilometers deeper than the others, breaking inside the sinking slab rather than along the boundary, and that single fact tells us the events are not one connected chain. The neat line is a trick of the flat map. Keep that in your mind, because now we have to explain the machine that can produce all of this without breaking a sweat. To understand why 6 earthquakes across 2,000 kilometers barely registers as unusual here, you have to understand the engine underneath, and the number that drives it is going to sound impossible the first time you hear it. Part 3. The engine. Underneath. Here is the number. Along this boundary, at its northern end, the Pacific plate is diving under the Australian plate at a speed of up to 24 centimeters every year. That is about 9.5 inches, every single year. I know that does not sound fast. 24 centimeters is roughly the length of your forearm from wrist to elbow. But you have to understand what is moving. This is not a car or a river. This is a slab of solid rock the size of an ocean floor, hundreds of kilometers across and tens of kilometers thick, and it is being shoved down into the mantle at the pace your fingernails grow. To move an object that large by even a fraction of a millimeter, you need forces that are almost impossible to picture. And this boundary does it at up to 24 centimeters a year, which makes it one of the fastest converging plate boundaries anywhere on the entire planet. Faster than any other subduction zone along the whole Ring of Fire. Nothing else in that great loop of collision zones is eating oceanic crust as quickly as this stretch of the Pacific is being eaten right here. That speed is the engine, and once you know the engine is running that hard, the 6 earthquakes we just counted stop looking like an event and start looking like exhaust. Because a plate diving that fast does not go quietly. Rock does not slide smoothly against rock. It sticks, and it strains, and it stores up energy like a bent spring, and then it snaps, and the snap is an earthquake. The faster you drive the convergence, the faster you load the spring, and the more often it releases. A boundary moving at 24 centimeters a year is a boundary that is constantly, relentlessly, building and releasing stress. That is why it can throw off a scatter of moderate quakes across 2,000 kilometers in 30 hours and have that count as ordinary. The engine never stops, and it does not just produce a lot of earthquakes, it produces enormous ones. This trench regularly generates earthquakes topping magnitude 8, Not once in a lifetime, regularly. Magnitude 8 is not a bigger version of the magnitude 5.6 that made everyone nervous this week. The magnitude scale is not linear, it is logarithmic, which means each whole step up represents about 32 times more energy released. So a magnitude 8 is not a little stronger than a magnitude 5. It is on the order of tens of thousands of times more energy. The events we have been discussing, the 5s and the 4s, are the small change this boundary throws off between the events that actually reshape coastlines. And this boundary produces those big ones on a schedule measured in decades, not millennia. There is one more thing this speed does, and it connects directly back to that deep earthquake we flagged north of Tonga. When a slab is driven down this fast, it plunges steeply and deeply into the mantle, and it stays cold and brittle far longer than a slowly sinking slab would. That is why this region hosts some of the deepest earthquakes recorded anywhere on Earth, events happening hundreds of kilometers down, inside a slab that is still rigid enough to crack even after it has been swallowed. That intra-slab quake at 114 kilometers we talked about is not an oddity here. It is a signature. It is the fingerprint of a slab going down hard and fast and breaking under the strain as it goes. So the very same speed that makes the boundary produce so many earthquakes is also the reason those earthquakes come from such wildly different depths, which is the reason, in turn, that the 6 events this week could never have been a single connected chain. It all traces back to the engine. So let me pull this straight back to the question you came in with, because I do not want the physics to float loose. The reason this cluster is not a warning is the same reason the cluster exists at all. This boundary is so fast and so loaded that scattered moderate earthquakes are simply what it does. The line on the map is not a special signal rising above the noise. On this boundary, this kind of activity is the noise, and you cannot read a warning in the noise because there is nothing for it to stand out against. Now here is where I have to be careful, because there is a version of this that tips into the wrong conclusion, and I have watched people make that leap. The wrong conclusion is, well, if the boundary is this violent and this overdue for a big one, then surely all this activity means the big one is finally here. That feels logical. It is also exactly backwards, and understanding why is one of the most important things I can give you tonight. The activity does not bring the big one closer in any way we can measure, and it does not tell us the big one is coming. The boundary is always loaded. It was loaded last month. It was loaded last year. A magnitude 8 could come from this trench next week or in 50 years, and the 6 earthquakes we saw this week move that needle by an amount so small that no instrument and no scientist on Earth can detect it. The engine running hard is not news. The engine has been running hard the entire time you have been alive. What makes this boundary genuinely frightening, then, is not that it woke up. The title of tonight says it woke up, and in the sense that it lit up the map with a visible burst of activity, it did. But the deeper truth is darker and quieter than that. This boundary never sleeps. It cannot. At 24 centimeters a year, there is no rest, no dormancy, no off switch. What we call it waking up is really just a moment when its constant background violence happened to arrange itself into a shape our eyes could see. The waking was in us, in our noticing, not in the boundary. The boundary was already awake, and it has been awake, grinding an ocean floor down into the mantle since long before anyone was watching. Let me explain what actually drives that dive, because it is more violent than the word convergent suggests. The main engine is not something pushing the plate from behind, it is the slab itself pulling. Old ocean floor, like the Pacific plate here, is cold and dense, denser than the hot mantle beneath it, and once its leading edge bends down into the earth, it begins to sink under its own weight, dragging the rest of the plate behind it like a tablecloth sliding off a table. Geologists call this slab pull, and it is one of the strongest forces in all of plate tectonics. Here, with a slab this old and this cold sinking this fast, the pull is enormous, and it is that pull, transmitted up through the whole system, that keeps the boundary loaded with strain every second of every day. And that sinking slab keeps making earthquakes far deeper than most people imagine is even possible. This region hosts some of the deepest earthquakes ever recorded, events happening as far down as around 700 kilometers below the surface, near the very bottom of the upper mantle. Think about that. Not 10 kilometers down where the plates meet, but 700 kilometers into the earth, where the slab has been swallowed almost beyond imagining and is still cold enough and stressed enough to crack. The intraslab quake we flagged at 114 kilometers is shallow by that standard. This boundary makes earthquakes through the entire depth of the descending slab top to bottom, which is exactly why the 6 events this week could scatter across such different depths and still all belong to the same system. History has already shown what this trench can do at full power, and recently. In August of 2021, the Kermadec region produced a magnitude 8.1 earthquake, one of the largest anywhere on Earth that year. It triggered tsunami warnings and evacuations across the Southwest Pacific, including in New Zealand, where people were sent to higher ground. That was not a hypothetical. That was this exact stretch of boundary, within living memory, doing the thing it regularly does, generating a genuine magnitude 8 class earthquake with a real tsunami threat. So when I say this trench regularly tops magnitude 8, I am not reaching for drama. I am describing an event that happened here just a few years ago, on the same boundary that produced this week's harmless cluster. That is the machine. Now we can go back to the events themselves with the tools to actually judge them. Because we have established that the boundary is fast enough to produce this activity as routine, and deep enough to produce quakes at radically different levels, which already tells us the 6 events are not one chain. But there is a competing explanation we have not closed off yet, the one that says maybe they are not a chain, but they are all children of that big March earthquake near Tonga. Aftershocks. And to kill that idea properly, we have to go back to March and look at where that magnitude 7.6 actually happened. Because it was not where you would think, and the depth of it changes everything about whether these July quakes could be its offspring at all. Part 4. The March Ghost. Back in March, this same region delivered something that actually was big. On March 24th, 2026, a magnitude 7.6 struck near Tonga. That is a serious earthquake by any measure, the strongest recorded anywhere on the planet so far this year up to that point. It happened about 130 kilometers off the coast of Vava'u, roughly 153 kilometers west of the town of Neafu. And for a few tense hours it looked like it might be a disaster, because a quake that size near an island nation raises the immediate spectre of a tsunami. But no destructive tsunami came, and the reason it did not is the single most important fact about that March earthquake, the fact that most coverage glossed over entirely. It was deep, extraordinarily deep. That magnitude 7.6 happened about 237 kilometers below the surface, not near the seafloor where a quake can shove a wall of water upward. More than 200 kilometers straight down, inside the sinking Pacific slab. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center looked at that depth and concluded there was no tsunami threat, because an earthquake that deep does not displace the ocean above it in the way a shallow one does. Tonga issued a precautionary alert sensibly and then lifted it. In the end, the March quake caused no significant damage, precisely because all that energy was released so far down in the earth. Now hold that depth next to the July cluster, because this is where the aftershock theory dies. When people say maybe these 6 July quakes are just aftershocks of the big March event, they are picturing something specific, even if they do not realize it. They are picturing the March earthquake as a shallow rupture that cracked the boundary and left it settling and readjusting for months, throwing off smaller shocks as it healed. That is how aftershock sequences usually work. A main shock breaks a patch of fault, and the surrounding rock, now rearranged, keeps popping in the same area, at the same kind of depth, gradually fading over weeks and months. But the March quake was 237 kilometers down. It was a deep event inside the slab, and the July cluster, for the most part, was shallow, up near the plate interface 10 kilometers down, with one outlier at 114. The depths do not line up. The mechanisms do not line up. An aftershock sequence from a 237-kilometer deep rupture does not express itself as a string of shallow quakes scattered across 2,000 kilometers of trench, some of them near Samoa, hundreds of kilometers from the March epicenter. Aftershocks cluster around their main shock in space and in depth. These do not. They are too shallow, too spread out, and too far away to be the children of March. There is a reason aftershock zones are compact, and it is worth a sentence because it seals the argument. Aftershocks happen because the main shock rearranged the stress in the rock immediately around the ruptured patch, so they cluster tightly around that patch, in the same neighborhood, at similar depth, and they fade over time in a predictable way, following a well-known pattern where they become less frequent as the days and weeks pass. A shallow rupture makes shallow aftershocks nearby. A deep rupture makes deep aftershocks nearby. What an aftershock sequence does not do is jump hundreds of kilometers away and change depth by 200 kilometers to produce a shallow quake near Samoa. That is not how the stress rearrangement works. So the July events fail the aftershock test on every measure that matters: location, depth, and spread. So we can close that door. These are not aftershocks of the March 7.6. And notice what has happened. We have now ruled out both of the two obvious ways to connect these earthquakes into a single story. They are not one propagating chain, because their depths are incompatible, and they are not aftershocks of a recent big quake, because that big quake was in the wrong place and far too deep to parent them. Two explanations, both of which would have made the cluster feel like a coherent building threat, and both of which the physical evidence simply does not support. There is a beautiful piece of physics hiding in why that deep March quake made no tsunami, and it is worth understanding because it also explains how a deep earthquake even happens at all. At 200 kilometers down, the pressure is so immense that rock should not be able to fracture in a brittle, sudden way the way it does near the surface. It should just deform slowly, like putty. So for decades, the existence of deep earthquakes was a genuine puzzle. The leading explanation is a process called dehydration embrittlement. The sinking slab carries water locked inside its minerals, and as it heats and compresses on the way down, that water is driven out, and the released fluid weakens the rock just enough to let it snap. So a deep earthquake is, in a sense, the slab wringing itself out, hundreds of kilometers below the seafloor. That is what the March 7.6 was. Not a boundary rupture near the surface that could shove the ocean upward, but a deep internal snap far too deep to move the water above it. That is why the tsunami never came, and that is precisely why it could never parent this week's shallow cluster. A rupture that deep releases its energy into the surrounding mantle at 200 kilometers down. It does not reach up and start breaking the shallow plate interface hundreds of kilometers away near Samoa. The two live in different layers of the Earth entirely, which leaves a question hanging in the air, and it is a good one. If they are not a chain, and they are not aftershocks, then what are they? Because 6 earthquakes in 30 hours still feels like it needs an explanation. It feels like too much to be nothing. The answer is almost anticlimactic, and that is exactly why it is easy to reject emotionally. What we are looking at is multiple independent ruptures on the same broad fault system, happening in the same general window of time, without any single one causing the others. Not a chain, not a family, just several separate releases of stress on a boundary that, as we have now established, is under so much strain and moving so fast that it produces this kind of activity as a matter of course. There is no hidden conductor coordinating them. There is just a very loaded, very fast boundary, and stress-finding release in several places at once, because there is that much of it to release. I understand why that answer feels unsatisfying. Coincidence offends us. When 6 things happen close together, every instinct says find the cause that ties them together. But sometimes the honest scientific answer is that a boundary this active will, by pure statistics, produce clusters that look meaningful and are not. The meaning is something we project onto the dots. The dots themselves are just an overworked plate boundary doing what an overworked plate boundary does. And here is the thread I want to keep pulling all the way through, because it is the real reason we are spending 2 hours on this. The fact that these 6 quakes are independent, uncoordinated and unremarkable for this boundary does not make the boundary safe. It makes it something worse in a way. It means the danger here is not episodic, not a thing that switches on when you see a cluster and off when the map goes quiet. The danger is continuous. It is the baseline. A boundary that can shrug off 6 moderate earthquakes across 2,000 kilometers without any of them meaning anything is a boundary that is always, at every moment, capable of producing the one that does mean something, and that one will not announce itself with a tidy warning cluster. That is the part almost nobody wants to hear. Because there is one more version of the connected story that we have not yet addressed, and it is the most seductive of all. Forget aftershocks. Forget a chain. What if these 6 are foreshocks? What if they are the small cracks that come before the big rupture, the boundary clearing its throat before it screams? That is the fear underneath all the others, and to deal with it honestly we have to confront something uncomfortable about the limits of what science can actually do. Because the answer to are these foreshocks is not a simple no. It is something far stranger and far more humbling than that. Part 5. The missing main shock. Here is the uncomfortable truth about foreshocks. We can only ever identify them after the fact. Think about what the word actually means. A foreshock is a smaller earthquake that comes before a larger one on the same fault. But notice the trick hidden in that definition. You cannot know an earthquake was a foreshock until the larger one arrives. Until then, it is just an earthquake. The exact same magnitude, 4.9, in the exact same spot, is a foreshock if a magnitude 8 follows it next week, and it is nothing at all, just background noise if no big quake ever comes. The earthquake does not change, only the future changes what we call it, which means the label foreshock is not a prediction. It is a memory. It is something we assign looking backward, never something we can confirm looking forward. And that is the deep, frustrating problem sitting at the centre of this whole story. When you look at the July cluster and ask, are these foreshocks? The honest answer is not a confident no. The honest answer is, there is no single main shock here, at least not yet, and there is no method in existence that can tell you whether there is going to be one. Scientists have spent decades, generations, hunting for a way to look at a sequence like this while it is happening and say, this one is different, this is the real precursor, the big one is coming. That method does not exist. Not because people have not tried hard enough, because the pattern simply is not there to be found. Study after study has gone looking for the signature that separates a foreshock swarm from ordinary background chatter, examined in advance, in real time, and come up empty. There is no clustering pattern, no count, no spacing, no lineup on a map that reliably announces a major earthquake before it happens. The clusters that turned out to precede great quakes look, in advance, identical to the thousands of clusters that preceded nothing at all. You only find out which kind you are looking at when either the big one arrives or it does not. Every single day, that is the situation on every active boundary on Earth, and it is the situation on this one. So when I tell you these 6 quakes are not a warning, I want to be precise about what I mean, because it is subtler than it sounds. I am not telling you I have looked at them and confirmed nothing bigger is coming. Nobody can tell you that, about this boundary or any other. What I am telling you is that this cluster gives us no additional information about whether something bigger is coming. It does not raise the odds in any measurable way. It does not start a clock. The probability of a great earthquake on this trench next month is essentially the same as it was before these 6 quakes happened, because these 6 quakes are statistically ordinary for this boundary, and ordinary activity does not shift the forecast. The cluster is not evidence of an impending disaster. It is also not evidence against one. It is simply not evidence either way, and that neutrality is the single hardest thing for the human brain to accept. Because we hate that answer. We are pattern-finding animals. Our ancestors survived by assuming the rustle in the grass was a predator, by seeing intention and cause everywhere, even where there was none, because the cost of a false alarm was small, and the cost of missing a real threat was death. That wiring served us brilliantly on the savannah. It serves us terribly when we stare at a map of earthquakes, because it screams at us that 6 dots in a line must mean something, must be building to something, must be a message. And there is no message. There is a fast, loaded boundary releasing stress the way it always does, and a mind on the other side of the screen desperate to turn that noise into a signal. Let me give you the hard numbers behind why this problem has resisted every attempt to solve it, because it is not for lack of effort. Studies of large earthquakes around the world have found that only a fraction of them, by many estimates roughly half, are preceded by any recognizable foreshock activity at all. Half. Which means that if you waited for a foreshock swarm before worrying, you would completely miss around half of all major earthquakes, because they arrive with no warning cluster whatsoever, out of a quiet boundary, with nothing in front of them. And on the other side of the ledger, the vast majority of small earthquake clusters that look exactly like foreshock swarms are followed by nothing at all. So you have a supposed warning sign that is absent before half of the real events, and present before countless non-events. That is not a warning sign. That is a coin flip wearing a lab coat. Seismologists have even built sophisticated statistical models to describe how earthquakes cluster, models with names like the epidemic-type aftershock sequence, which treat every earthquake as capable of triggering others in a cascade of probabilities. Those models are genuinely useful. They can tell you that after any earthquake, the odds of another nearby one are temporarily raised. But here is the crucial limit. They work in probabilities across many events, not predictions of single ones. The model can say the background rate is slightly elevated for a few days. It cannot say this particular magnitude 5 is the foreshock and the big one lands Thursday. That specific actionable prediction, the one everyone actually wants, is exactly the thing the science cannot deliver. There is a cautionary tale wrapped up in all this. Years ago in Italy, in the town of L'Aquila, a swarm of small earthquakes preceded a deadly larger one, and in the painful aftermath there was enormous public anger over what officials had and had not said about the risk. The lasting lesson scientists took from it was not that they should have predicted the quake. It was that they must be brutally honest about what they cannot predict, because false reassurance and false alarm are both dangerous. That is the spirit I am trying to bring to this cluster. Not a promise that nothing will happen, but an honest accounting of the fact that these 6 quakes tell us nothing new about tomorrow. Now let me connect this straight back to New Zealand, because this is where the fear actually lives. The people watching this cluster in New Zealand are not really afraid of a magnitude 5.6 in the Kermadecs. They are afraid that the 5.6 is a knock on the door, a preview, the first tremor of something that could reach the mainland. And what I am telling you is that seismology has no way to know whether it is. Not because the risk is fake, but because the tools to read a warning out of a cluster like this genuinely do not exist. The 5.6 tells us the boundary is active. We already knew the boundary was active. It tells us nothing new about tomorrow. People sometimes ask why, with all our satellites and sensors and computing power, earthquake prediction remains stuck where it is while weather forecasting has become so good. The comparison is revealing. We can forecast weather because we can see it. The atmosphere is right there, measurable in real time, its pressures and temperatures and winds sampled continuously across the whole planet. The stress inside a fault, 10 or 20 kilometers down, is not visible to us. We cannot put a sensor on the locked patch of a subduction boundary and read its strain directly. We infer it, indirectly, from surface measurements and past behavior, through a fog. Predicting an earthquake is less like forecasting a storm you can watch on radar and more like trying to guess the exact moment. A stretched rubber band sealed inside a locked box will finally snap when you cannot see the band and can only feel the faint occasional twitch of the box. That is the fundamental reason the warning everyone wants does not exist, and it is not a gap that a few more sensors will close. That should be humbling, and honestly it should also be a little liberating. Because if no cluster can predict the big one, then watching clusters obsessively, refreshing the earthquake map, feeling your stomach drop every time a new dot appears near New Zealand, none of that is actually protecting you. It cannot. The information you are hunting for in those dots is not in there. And once you truly absorb that, the question shifts. It stops being, is this the warning? And becomes, what is the actual risk? Always, regardless of what the map is doing this week. That is a question that does have an answer, and it is a far more useful one to sit with. But before we get to New Zealand's real, standing risk, we have to nail down one more piece. Because I have been telling you that 6 earthquakes in 30 hours is ordinary for this boundary, and you have every right to demand that I prove it rather than just assert it. Ordinary compared to what? How do we actually know that this is background noise and not something elevated? The answer comes down to base rates, to what this trench does on a normal week when nobody's watching and no video gets made. And when you put this cluster against that baseline, it shrinks to something almost embarrassingly unremarkable. Let me show you exactly how unremarkable. Part 6. What 30 hours actually means. The Kermadec Tonga zone produces earthquakes in the magnitude 4 to magnitude 6 range essentially constantly. Not occasionally, not in bursts around big events. Constantly, as a steady drumbeat day after day, most of them out in open water where no one feels them and no headline is written. This is one of the most seismically active regions on the entire planet. It is not a boundary that has quiet years punctuated by scary weeks. It is a boundary that shakes all the time. So run the arithmetic that matters. 6 earthquakes in that magnitude range, spread across a distance of 2,000 kilometers, over a window of about 30 hours. Spread that out. 2,000 kilometers is an enormous stretch of trench, longer than the distance from the top of Italy to the bottom. 30 hours is more than a day. And in that vast space, over that stretch of time, on a boundary that generates 4s and 5s as its resting heartbeat, you got 6 of them. When you frame it that way, the honest scientific verdict is not alarming. It is that this pattern, all by itself, is well within normal background activity for this stretch of trench. It is not statistically unusual. It is close to exactly what you would expect this boundary to do in any given day and a half, if you happen to be watching closely enough to notice. The reason it does not feel ordinary is entirely about attention. On a normal week, nobody plots these events. They happen, the instruments record them, they get logged in a database, and the world moves on. It takes something, a slightly larger shock like the 5.6, a moment of someone actually looking at the map, for the routine to suddenly become visible. And the instant it becomes visible, our pattern-seeking mind grabs it and insists it must be special. But the only thing that was special was that we looked. The activity was always there. We just gave it our attention this time, and attention has a way of manufacturing significance out of things that have none. Let me put the base rate idea in plainer terms, because it is the hinge of this entire argument. Imagine a road where, on average, a car passes every 10 minutes, all day, all night, forever. If you stand there and watch for half an hour and count 3 cars, you have not witnessed anything. You have witnessed the road being a road. Now imagine you had never been told how busy the road was, and someone showed you a photo of 3 cars and asked, "Does this look like a traffic surge to you?" You might say yes. 3 cars, all in one picture. But it is not a surge. It is the baseline. You were just never shown the baseline before. That is exactly what is happening with this earthquake cluster. 6 quakes looks like a lot until you know that this particular road has cars passing on it every few minutes, forever. To put the base rate on a global scale, consider that the whole planet produces something like 55,000 earthquakes of magnitude 4 or greater every single year, and on the order of 100,000 of magnitude 3 or greater, most of them out under oceans and across remote regions where no one feels a thing. Somewhere in the range of 15 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or larger happen every year, year in and year out. The Earth is not quiet. It is constantly shaking, everywhere, all the time, and the only reason it feels quiet is that the overwhelming majority of that activity happens far from people or too small to notice. Against that global background, 6 moderate quakes on the single most active boundary in the Southwest Pacific in a day and a half does not even register as a blip. It is a rounding error in the planet's daily seismic budget. This is why the search for a predictive pattern keeps failing, and it connects right back to what we said about foreshocks. You cannot pick out a meaningful signal when the background noise looks just like the signal you are hunting for. On a quiet fault, 6 earthquakes in 30 hours might genuinely be anomalous, might be worth raising an eyebrow. On the Tonga Kermadec boundary, 6 earthquakes in 30 hours is Tuesday. The very thing that makes this boundary so dangerous, its relentless activity, is the same thing that makes any given cluster on it meaningless as a warning. The noise is too loud for the signal to ever stand out. There is an actual law of nature behind why 6 moderate quakes is so unremarkable, and it has a name. It is called the Gutenberg-Richter relationship, and it is one of the most reliable patterns in all of seismology. What it says is that for any given region, small earthquakes are vastly more common than large ones, in a fixed proportion. Step down 1 unit of magnitude, and you get roughly 10 times as many earthquakes. So for every magnitude 6 a region produces, it produces on the order of 10 magnitude 5s, and around 100 magnitude 4s, and 1,000 magnitude 3s. That ratio holds astonishingly well almost everywhere on Earth. Now apply that to a boundary as active as this one. On a trench that produces the occasional magnitude 8, the Gutenberg-Richter relationship guarantees a steady rain of 7s, and a heavier rain of 6s, and a downpour of 5s and 4s, all the time, as an unavoidable mathematical consequence of the big ones existing at all. You literally cannot have a boundary capable of magnitude 8 earthquakes, without it also constantly producing swarms of 4s and 5s. They come as a package. So 6 moderate quakes in a day and a half is not a signal that the big one is loading. It is the ordinary lower end of the exact same distribution that occasionally produces the giant. The small ones are always there. They are the mathematical shadow of the boundary's capacity for large ones, and that shadow falls every single day. This is why a working seismologist looking at this cluster does not reach for the alarm. They see the Gutenberg-Richter distribution doing precisely what it always does. The moderate quakes are the many, the great quakes are the few, and the presence of the many tells you nothing about the timing of the few. It only confirms what you already knew, that this is a boundary fully capable of the few. And I want to be scrupulously fair here, because there is a real point buried in the fear that deserves respect. It is true that we cannot rule out that one of these 6 was, in fact, a foreshock to something bigger that has not arrived yet. We established that. Nobody can rule that out ever on any active boundary. But absence of the ability to rule it out is not the same as evidence for it. Every day on this trench carries that same irreducible uncertainty, cluster or no cluster. The 6 quakes did not create the uncertainty. The uncertainty is the permanent condition of living next to a subduction zone. What the cluster did was make that permanent uncertainty suddenly feel acute and specific, when in reality it is chronic and unchanged. So here is where we have arrived, and it is worth saying clearly before we turn toward New Zealand itself. The pattern is not unusual. The count is not elevated above what this boundary normally produces. The lineup is a product of the trench's own geometry. The depths prove the events are not one connected rupture. Their location and depth prove they are not aftershocks of March, and no science exists that could read a prediction out of them even if we wanted it to. Every single road that leads from this cluster to the big one is coming turns out to be a dead end. That is not me downplaying anything. That is just where the evidence goes when you follow it honestly. But I promised you at the start that the fact this cluster is not a warning does not mean the danger is small, and now we get to the heart of that. Because there is a country sitting at the southern end of this line, a country that felt the biggest of these 6 quakes inside its own territory, and that country lives every single day on top of hazards that make this cluster look like nothing. New Zealand does not need a warning from the Kermadec Trench to be in danger. New Zealand is already in danger, all the time, from 2 things directly beneath its own islands, and understanding what those 2 things are is the only way to see this whole story clearly. Let me take you there, to the real threat, the one that was never out at sea in the first place. Part 7. The country. At the end of the line. New Zealand sits at the bottom of that line of dots for a reason that has nothing to do with this week's cluster. It sits there because the same collision we have been talking about, the Pacific Plate meeting the Australian Plate, does not stop at the Kermadec Trench. It keeps going south, and as it reaches New Zealand it comes ashore and becomes the country's own problem. The boundary that produced those 6 earthquakes out at sea is the northern end of a system that runs right through New Zealand itself. So when people there look at the cluster marching toward them, part of what unsettles them is correct. It is the same plate boundary. It really does connect. The question is only whether that connection means what they fear it means, and to answer that we have to look at the 2 hazards New Zealand carries in its own body. The first is called the Hikurangi Subduction Zone. It runs along the east coast of the North Island just offshore, and it is the direct continuation of the Pacific-Australian convergence we have been tracing all night. Here, the same kind of megathrust boundary that generates magnitude 8 earthquakes further north lies right against the most populated island in the country. A great rupture on the Hikurangi zone is one of the largest natural threats New Zealand faces, capable of severe shaking and a tsunami arriving on the coast in minutes. This is not fringe speculation. It is the central scenario that New Zealand's scientists and emergency planners build around, because it is a matter of when the boundary produces a great earthquake, not if. The second hazard is more famous, and in some ways more haunting. It is the Alpine Fault, and it tears down almost the entire length of the South Island, a single clean gash in the crust where the 2 plates grind past each other. The Alpine Fault is one of the most studied faults on Earth, and the reason it frightens people is not mystery. It is the opposite of mystery. It is how well we understand it. Because the Alpine Fault does something rare among faults. It ruptures on a schedule regular enough that scientists can actually talk about it in terms of averages. Roughly every 300 years, give or take, the Alpine Fault produces a major earthquake on the order of magnitude 8, rupturing hundreds of kilometres of the South Island in a matter of minutes. And here is the part that sits in the back of every New Zealander's mind. The last time the Alpine Fault produced one of those major ruptures was in the year 1717. Do that subtraction. That is more than 300 years ago, which means, on average, the Alpine Fault is now at or past the point where it has historically let go. In the language scientists use carefully and the public uses nervously, it is overdue. Recent research has put the probability of a major Alpine Fault rupture within the next 50 years at around 75%. 75%. That is not a distant abstract risk. That is a coin so heavily weighted toward heads that, in geological terms, everyone is simply waiting for it to land. How do we even know the Alpine Fault ruptures roughly every 300 years, given that no one was writing it down in 1717? The answer is one of the quiet triumphs of earthquake science. Geologists dig trenches across the fault and read the layers of earth like pages in a book. Each great rupture disturbs the ground in a way that leaves a mark, offsetting old stream channels, burying soil layers, dropping debris, and by carefully dating those layers with organic material trapped in them, scientists can reconstruct a record of past earthquakes going back thousands of years. On the Alpine fault, that record is remarkably regular, which is rare and unsettling, because most faults rupture erratically. This one keeps a rhythm. The Paleoseismic record shows a long series of major ruptures spaced roughly 2 to 3 centuries apart, and the last one, in 1717, ruptured an extraordinary length of the fault, perhaps 400 kilometres of it, in a single event. That regularity is exactly why scientists can put a number like 75% within 50 years on it with a straight face. New Zealand's history has already delivered warnings of what its faults can do. In 1855, the Wairarapa earthquake struck near what is now the Wellington region, a magnitude estimated around 8.2, one of the most powerful earthquakes to hit the country in recorded history. It lifted sections of coastline several metres and reshaped the land around the capital. That was not the Alpine fault, and it was not the Kermadec Trench. It was yet another strand of the same plate boundary system running through New Zealand, and it is a documented historical reminder that the great earthquake here is not a matter of if. There is also something strange and important happening offshore on the Hikurangi zone that deepens the picture. That boundary experiences what are called slow slip events, sometimes nicknamed silent earthquakes, where a section of the fault slips gradually over days or weeks without producing violent shaking. These silent slips release strain quietly, but they also load neighbouring locked patches of the fault, and scientists watch them closely because they change the stress on the very part of the boundary that could one day produce a great rupture and tsunami. New Zealand is not passively waiting. It is monitoring its own faults in extraordinary detail precisely because the threat is so real. So now you can feel the real weight of the question this cluster raised. It was never really, are these 6 moderate quakes dangerous? It was, could these 6 quakes, on the boundary that connects to New Zealand, be the thing that finally tips a fault that is already sitting at 75%, already overdue, already loaded, into letting go? When you frame it like that, you can understand why the map made people's hearts race. It is not stupidity. It is the collision of a genuine, well-documented, terrifying standing risk with a fresh cluster of activity on the connected boundary, and the mind doing what minds do, drawing the line between them. But watch what that framing quietly assumes. It assumes that the cluster and the Alpine fault are close enough and connected enough for one to influence the other, and that is exactly the assumption we now have to test, because it is doing all the emotional work and it has not yet been examined. The Kermadec quakes are hundreds of kilometres, in some cases well over 1,000 kilometres, from the Alpine fault. They are moderate. The Alpine fault is a separate structure with its own clock, a clock that has been ticking towards 75% entirely on its own, driven by 3 centuries of accumulated strain, with no help needed from anything happening out at the Kermadec Trench this week. The overdue status of the Alpine fault is not news this cluster created. It was true last month. It was true last year. It will be true next year whether or not any cluster ever appears on the map again. That is the thread I need you to hold as we go into the most important question of the entire night. New Zealand's real risk, from Hikurangi and from the Alpine fault, is a constant, standing, everyday risk. It does not switch on because the Kermadec Trench lit up, and it will not switch off when the map goes quiet again. It is independent of the headlines, and that independence is the crux because it means the honest question is not whether this cluster raised New Zealand's risk. The honest question is whether a moderate earthquake hundreds of kilometres away can reach across all that ocean and all that rock and physically nudge a fault like the Alpine into rupturing early. That is a real scientific question with a real scientific answer, and it is more interesting and more reassuring and in one specific way more unsettling than you might expect. Let me take it apart. Part 8. Can a quake reach across an ocean? When an earthquake happens, it changes the world around it in 2 completely different ways, and you have to separate them to answer the New Zealand question. The first way is permanent. When a fault slips, it physically rearranges the stress in the rock nearby, loading some faults a little closer to failure and relaxing others. We call this static stress change, and it is why a big earthquake is often followed by others in its immediate vicinity. The crust around the rupture has been shoved into a new configuration, and neighbouring faults feel that shove. But the word that matters in that sentence is nearby. Static stress change falls off with distance, and it falls off brutally fast. The effect is meaningful mainly for faults within roughly 1 or 2 rupture lengths of the earthquake that caused it. For a moderate quake, a magnitude 5, the rupture itself is only a few kilometres long, which means its static stress influence reaches out only a few kilometres. A magnitude 5 in the Kermadec does not reach out and reload a fault hundreds of kilometres away, let alone one over 1,000 kilometres away in the South Island. The physics simply does not stretch that far. The permanent shove these 6 quakes gave to the surrounding crust died out in the open ocean, close to where each one happened, nowhere near New Zealand's faults. So static stress transfer, the mechanism most people are unconsciously imagining when they picture stress marching down the boundary, is off the table entirely at these distances and these magnitudes. That leaves the second way an earthquake changes the world, and this one is more interesting because it can travel. When a fault slips, it sends out seismic waves, the shaking itself, and those waves radiate outward across enormous distances. And there is a real, documented phenomenon where the passing waves from a distant earthquake can nudge a fault somewhere else into slipping. We call it dynamic triggering. The shaking from a faraway quake rolls through, and if a fault was already sitting right on the edge of failure, that passing tremor can be the final flick that sets it off a little sooner than it would have gone on its own. This is genuinely real. It has been observed. It is not fringe science. So this is the part worth being honest and careful about, because dynamic triggering is the one mechanism that could, in principle, let a distant quake reach New Zealand. And I am not going to wave it away because it exists, but I am going to tell you exactly what it does and does not do, because the details are everything. Dynamic triggering almost always sets off small things. It triggers minor tremors, tiny bursts of microseismicity, little clusters of small quakes in faraway geothermal fields and volcanic areas when the waves from a great earthquake wash through. What it does not do, in essentially any well-documented case, is set off a major rupture. It nudges faults into small slips, not catastrophic ones. And crucially, it takes big waves to do even that. The dramatic cases of dynamic triggering come from genuinely great earthquakes, magnitude 7s, 8s, and above, whose surface waves are powerful enough to still carry a punch after travelling halfway around the world. To understand why size matters so much for this, you need to know that an earthquake sends out several different kinds of waves. First come the fast P waves, the initial jolt, then the S waves, the stronger side-to-side shaking, and then, travelling along the surface of the Earth, the surface waves, the slow, rolling, long-period motion that carries the most energy over long distances and does the most to shake distant faults. It is those surface waves that do the work in dynamic triggering. And their amplitude, the sheer size of the ground motion they carry, scales dramatically with the magnitude of the source. A great earthquake sends out surface waves that are still large after crossing an ocean. A magnitude 5 sends out surface waves that are modest to begin with, and fade to almost nothing within a few hundred kilometres. The best documented cases of dynamic triggering make this vivid. When the magnitude 7.3 Landers earthquake struck California in 1992, its waves set off tiny bursts of seismicity as far away as Yellowstone, more than 1,000 kilometres distant, in a geothermal region primed to respond. When the magnitude 7.9 Denali earthquake hit Alaska in 2002, its surface waves triggered small quakes in Yellowstone again, and in other geothermal and volcanic areas across the western United States. Notice 2 things about those examples. The sources were great earthquakes, in the 7s and near 8, and what they triggered, even at those distances, was small tremors in geothermal fields, not major ruptures on locked faults. That is the ceiling of what dynamic triggering does. Great quake in, tiny quakes out. Now weigh the July cluster against that. These were magnitude 5s. The waves from a magnitude 5 are a whisper compared to the waves from a magnitude 8, and they lose their energy rapidly as they spread out. By the time the shaking from a magnitude 5.6 in the Kermadec has travelled the hundreds of kilometres, in some cases well over 1,000, to reach the Alpine Fault, there is almost nothing left of it. It is a ripple that started small and faded to nothing along the way. To imagine that ripple reaching across all that rock and delivering enough of a jolt to trigger a magnitude 8 rupture on the Alpine fault is to imagine a mechanism operating thousands of times beyond anything it has ever been observed to do. There is no evidence for it, and there is no plausible physical pathway to it. The waves are too weak and the distance is too great. And remember the logarithmic scale doing its brutal work in the background here. The energy released by an earthquake climbs by around 32 times for each whole step of magnitude. So the surface waves radiating from the Kermadec 5.6 carry something on the order of tens of thousands of times less energy than the waves from a great magnitude 8. The distant faults that great earthquakes occasionally nudge are being touched by a fire hose. What the Kermadec cluster sends toward New Zealand, after that energy has spread out and weakened across hundreds of kilometres of crust, is less than a drip. There is a genuine threshold effect at work. Below a certain amplitude, the passing waves simply do not carry enough of a jolt to matter to a fault, no matter how stressed that fault already is, and moderate quakes at great distances fall far below that line. This is not a matter of the effect being small. It is a matter of the effect being absent, drowned out by the ordinary background stresses the fault experiences every day from tides, from seasons, from the weight of passing weather systems. So put the two mechanisms together and you have your answer. Static stress transfer is far too short range to matter here. Dynamic triggering can travel, but at these magnitudes over these distances it carries nowhere near enough energy to do anything but, at the very most, jostle a few small tremors, and even that is a stretch. For this specific cluster to trigger the Alpine fault's next great earthquake, there is no evidence and no mechanism that makes it remotely likely. The ocean between the Kermadecs and New Zealand is not just water. It is a vast expanse of rock that swallows the energy of a moderate earthquake long before it could ever reach a fault on the other side. And here is the turn, the thing that is in one specific way more unsettling than the fear it replaces. The reason you can stop worrying about the cluster triggering the Alpine fault is not that the Alpine fault is safe. It is that the Alpine fault does not need the cluster. It is going to rupture on its own, driven by 3 centuries of its own accumulated strain, on its own timetable, at 75% within 50 years, entirely without any help from the Kermadec Trench. The cluster is irrelevant to that fault not because the fault is quiet, but because the fault is already a loaded gun with its own trigger. Removing the cluster from the story does not make New Zealand safer. It just moves your attention off the thing that cannot hurt it and back onto the thing that can, which was there the whole time, and which no earthquake map lineup will ever warn you about. That is the honest shape of the danger. But I have been talking about triggering as if it never happens at all, and that is not quite true either. There is one setting where earthquakes really do trigger other earthquakes, and understanding it tells you exactly why this cluster is the wrong thing to fear, and what the right thing would even look like. It comes down to the difference between a fault reaching across an ocean, which does not happen, and a fault reaching across a few kilometres to its own neighbour, which does. Part 9. What triggering actually looks like. Consider 2 of the most feared fault systems in the world, the San Andreas in California and the Cascadia subduction zone in the Pacific Northwest. Both are capable of devastating earthquakes. Both have been studied for a century. And here is the telling fact. We have no evidence that they have ever triggered each other. They are separate systems, hundreds of kilometres apart, and despite all the great earthquakes each has produced over geological time, one has never been shown to have set off the other across that distance. If 2 giants that close, that active, that well monitored, do not reach across the gap between them, then the idea that a cluster of magnitude 5s in the Kermadecs reaches over 1,000 kilometres to the Alpine fault collapses under its own weight. Great faults do not trigger other great faults across large distances. That is simply not how the system behaves. Consider what Cascadia is actually capable of, so you appreciate the point. The Cascadia subduction zone last produced a great earthquake in the year 1700, a magnitude around 9, so powerful that it sent a tsunami clear across the Pacific to Japan, where it was recorded in written history as an orphan wave with no local earthquake to explain it. We know the date almost precisely because of those Japanese records combined with tree ring evidence in North America. Here is the point. That was a magnitude 9, one of the largest earthquakes the planet can produce, and there is no evidence it triggered the San Andreas fault, which runs not far to the south. If a full magnitude 9 megathrust rupture does not reach over to pull the trigger on a neighbouring great fault, then nothing a magnitude 5 in the Kermadec does is going to reach across a far greater distance to the Alpine fault. The scale of the mismatch is almost absurd once you lay it out. But there is a kind of triggering that is real, and it happens at a completely different scale, and it is worth understanding because it shows you where the actual danger lives. Take the San Andreas again. Branching off the main fault are many smaller faults, splays and neighbours, tangled up in the same crust. And there is good reason to think that when one of those smaller faults ruptures and shakes the immediate area, it can, in some cases, help nudge the main fault, the big one, into going. That is triggering that matters. But look at what makes it work. It is local. The small fault is right there, entangled with the big one, sharing the same few kilometres of rock. The trigger and the target are neighbours. The energy does not have to survive a 1,000-kilometre journey through the crust. It only has to cross the street. That is the whole difference, and it is the difference that settles the New Zealand question completely. Triggering is a neighbourhood phenomenon. A fault can influence the fault right next to it, the one sharing its own patch of ground. What a fault cannot do is reach across an ocean and pull the trigger on a completely separate system on the far side. So if you want to know what could actually set off the Alpine fault early, the answer is not a distant cluster in the Kermadecs. The answer, if it is anything, would be activity on the Alpine fault's own local neighbours, the smaller structures tangled into the South Island crust right alongside it. Those are the things close enough to matter. The Kermadec quakes are not in that neighbourhood. They are not even in the same country's worth of crust. They are spectators, not participants. And there is a subtlety here that actually cuts against the scary story rather than for it. When a fault ruptures, it does not only load its neighbours, it can also relax them, casting what seismologists call a stress shadow over nearby faults, temporarily making them less likely to slip because the rupture released tension they were sharing. So the naive picture, where every earthquake simply pushes every nearby fault closer to failure, is wrong even at close range. Stress goes both ways, loading some patches and unloading others in a complicated pattern that depends entirely on geometry. This is another reason you cannot just look at a cluster and assume it is winding everything around it toward catastrophe. Even genuine local stress transfer is as likely to calm a neighbouring patch as to excite it. The real behaviour of stress in the crust is far more intricate and far less like a fuse burning toward a bomb than the frightening version assumes. So when you hear someone look at the map and say the stress is transferring toward New Zealand, you now have the tools to know precisely why that is wrong. Stress transfer is real, but it is short-ranged, dying out within a few kilometres of a moderate quake. Dynamic triggering is real, but it takes great earthquakes to reach far, and even then it triggers small things, not catastrophes. And genuine fault-to-fault triggering of a major rupture is a local affair, between neighbours sharing the same rock. None of those three mechanisms let 6 moderate earthquakes out in the Pacific reach across to the faults under New Zealand. The transfer people picture, stress flowing like water down the boundary toward the mainland, is not a thing that the physics allows, and I want to pause on how much better this is than the alternative, because it is easy to hear all this and feel only the fear that remains rather than the fear that has been removed. What we have just done is take the single scariest version of this story, the version where a burst of earthquakes offshore is the opening move in a sequence that ends with a city on the South Island in ruins, and we have shown that there is no mechanism connecting the two. The offshore cluster and the Alpine fault are not links in a chain, they are strangers. That is genuinely good news, and it is earned good news, built from the actual physics rather than from reassurance. But the same analysis that frees you from the cluster hands you back the real thing to sit with, and I am not going to hide it from you, because this channel does not trade one comfortable illusion for another. The real thing is this: the Alpine fault is going to rupture, not because of the Kermadecs, because of itself. 300 years of strain, 75% within 50 years, a great earthquake on the South Island that is a matter of when. The Hikurangi zone offshore of the North Island carries its own great earthquake and its own tsunami, again a matter of when. Those are the standing facts of living in New Zealand, and they do not need a cluster to make them true. The cluster was a distraction, a bright light out at sea that pulled everyone's eyes offshore, when the thing that will actually shape lives is directly underfoot and has been the entire time. Which brings us to something I have been holding back, because it is the piece that turns this from an abstract discussion of mechanisms into something with real human weight. We keep calling these 6 earthquakes moderate, and we keep saying they hurt no one. Both of those things are true this week, in this place, out in open water. But moderate is one of the most dangerous words in this entire subject, because whether an earthquake is harmless or catastrophic often has almost nothing to do with its magnitude and everything to do with what is sitting on top of it. And that is where the real lesson of this cluster lives, not in the physics of triggering, but in a truth about earthquakes that the whole world relearns, painfully, over and over again. Part 10. Why Moderate is a Lie. The 6 earthquakes this week were moderate and they hurt no one, and those two facts are connected by a single thing: water. They happened out under the open ocean, far from anyone. Move those exact same earthquakes, the exact same magnitudes, and put them underneath a densely populated city built out of the wrong materials, and the word moderate becomes a headstone. We have seen this again and again, and recently. Earthquakes in the moderate to strong range have caused devastating loss of life in places like Peru, in Afghanistan, in Turkey, not because those quakes were geological monsters, but because of what stood above them. When a magnitude 5 or 6 strikes beneath a town where buildings are made of unreinforced masonry, of heavy concrete floors resting on walls that cannot flex, of construction that was never designed to move with the ground, those buildings come down, and it is the buildings that kill people, almost never the shaking itself. An earthquake does not crush anyone in an open field. It crushes people under roofs and walls and floors that were not built to stay up. The magnitude sets how hard the ground moves. Everything else, whether that motion becomes a death toll or a story people tell over dinner, is decided by human choices made years or decades earlier, in concrete and steel and building code. That is why I keep insisting the word moderate is a lie, or at least a dangerous half-truth. Moderate describes the energy. It does not describe the outcome. The same magnitude that is a non-event under the Kermadec Islands is a catastrophe under a poorly built city, and the difference between those two outcomes is not written in the rock. It is written in the architecture. This is one of the most important and least understood facts in all of earthquake science, and it flips the entire way you should think about risk. The question is never just how big was the quake. The question is always, how big was the quake, and what was standing on top of it, and how was that thing built? New Zealand knows this lesson in its own bones, because it has lived both sides of it. In 1931, the Hawke's Bay earthquake struck the town of Napier, a magnitude around 7.8, and it killed a large number of people and flattened much of the town, in part because of the building styles of the era. That disaster became a turning point. It drove sweeping changes in how New Zealand built, ushering in earthquake-conscious design and stricter codes that have evolved ever since. Then, much more recently, came the event that proves the point about moderate quakes better than anything I could invent. In 2011, a magnitude 6.3 earthquake struck beneath Christchurch. 6.3, on our scale that is moderate to strong, not a monster, and it killed 185 people and devastated the city centre. Why was a magnitude 6.3 so deadly, when this week's 5s out at sea harmed no one? Everything we have been talking about concentrated in one tragedy. The Christchurch quake was shallow and struck almost directly beneath the city, so the ground motion at the surface was ferocious, among the most intense ever recorded in an urban area. The soft, waterlogged soils beneath parts of the city underwent liquefaction, turning solid ground to something like quicksand, so that buildings sank and tilted. And some older structures had not been built or retrofitted to withstand that kind of shaking. Magnitude 6.3, and a city broke. That is the whole lesson in a single event, and it happened in New Zealand, which is exactly why the country treats its faults with the seriousness it does. So when I tell you these 6 ocean quakes were harmless, I am not telling you New Zealand can relax. I am telling you the opposite in a sense. The country already knows, from Napier and from Christchurch, that magnitude is only half the story, and that a moderate quake in the wrong place beneath the wrong ground is a catastrophe. What protects it is not luck and not warning clusters. It is that hard-won knowledge, poured into concrete and code. Now bring that straight back to New Zealand and to this cluster, because it sharpens everything we have said. When the Alpine Fault or the Hikurangi Zone finally produces its great earthquake, that will not be a moderate event out at sea. It will be a magnitude 8 or near it, on land or just offshore, close to real communities. And this is where New Zealand's story diverges sharply from the tragedies in those other places, because New Zealand has spent decades preparing for exactly this. Precisely because it lives with such a large and well-understood risk, New Zealand has built one of the best earthquake early warning research, monitoring, and building code systems anywhere in the world. Its buildings are designed to move with the ground rather than shatter against it. Its scientists watch these faults continuously. Its emergency planning treats the great earthquake not as an unthinkable surprise, but as a known event to be ready for. That preparation is the reason the honest message here is not doom. A country sitting on faults like these, but with world-class codes and monitoring and public awareness, is in a fundamentally different position from a town where the buildings will pancake at the first hard shake. Preparation is the single biggest lever any society has over its own earthquake death toll, far bigger than any warning cluster could ever be, because preparation works no matter when the quake comes, and it works precisely because it does not depend on predicting the day. You cannot predict the great earthquake. You can build so that it does not become a massacre when it arrives. New Zealand has largely chosen the second path, and that choice will save more lives than any amount of watching the map ever could. So look at what the cluster actually did in light of all this. It pulled everyone's attention to 6 harmless quakes out at sea, quakes that were moderate in every sense and dangerous in none, on a night when the genuinely important truths were these. New Zealand's real risk is on its own faults, not in the Kermadec lineup. That risk is a matter of when, not if. And the thing that determines whether that eventual great earthquake is a tragedy or a survived disaster is not whether anyone saw it coming, but whether the buildings and the plans and the public were ready. The cluster was noise, the preparation is the signal, and almost all the emotional energy this week flowed toward the noise. That is the pattern I want you to start noticing, because it repeats everywhere in how we react to natural hazards. We fixate on the dramatic, visible headline event, the lineup on the map, the scary cluster, and we look right past the quiet, boring, unglamorous thing that actually decides how many people live. Building codes are not exciting. Retrofitting an old school is not exciting. A seismograph logging another routine magnitude 4 is not exciting. But those are where survival is actually won and lost, and no burst of offshore earthquakes will ever change that math one way or the other. Now, I have been giving you the careful, evidence-based version of this story all night, the version where the cluster means very little and the real risk lives elsewhere. But there is another version circulating out there, a louder one, full of hidden connections and suppressed warnings and forces that mainstream science supposedly refuses to acknowledge. And I do not think the right response to those ideas is to sneer at them, because some of them come from a completely understandable place. So let us actually walk through what people are saying about clusters like this, the theories that spread every time the map lights up, and let us take each one seriously enough to see exactly where it holds together and exactly where it falls apart. Part 11. The Conspiracy of the Lineup. The first thing people say when they see a cluster like this is the most natural of all. They line up, so they must be connected, and if they are connected, something is building. We have already dismantled the connected part, but I want to name where the feeling comes from, because it is not stupid. It comes from the alignment itself. A straight line of dots looks designed. It looks like cause and effect walking down a path. But here is the quiet answer that dissolves it. The lineup is the shape of the trench, not the shape of a trigger. Earthquakes on a long, narrow plate boundary will always plot as a long, narrow line, because the fault they happen on is a long, narrow line. Finding earthquakes arranged along a trench is like finding houses arranged along a street. The arrangement is the street. It is not evidence that something is travelling down it, delivering the quakes one by one. The line was always going to be there the moment this boundary released any energy at all. The second theory is the one we keep circling because it is the most emotionally powerful. This is a foreshock swarm, and the big one is imminent. And I will say again, with as much respect as I can, that the honest problem with this idea is not that it is crazy. It is that there is no way to know. Decades of scientific effort have failed to find any reliable method to tell, in advance, whether a given cluster is a foreshock sequence or ordinary background noise. In hindsight, after a great earthquake, we can point back and say those were foreshocks. But no clustering pattern, no lineup, no count observed beforehand has ever reliably predicted a major earthquake. So the theory is not debunked because we know the big one is not coming. It is debunked as a prediction, because the prediction cannot be made by anyone, by any method, from data like this. Claiming a cluster foretells the big one is claiming a power that no scientist on Earth possesses. The third idea is darker. It says the real danger is being hidden, that agencies know something and are keeping it quiet to prevent panic. And I understand the instinct toward distrust. But look at what the actual behaviour of these agencies is. The United States Geological Survey, New Zealand's own Geological Monitoring Service, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Centre, they publish this data in near real time, openly, for anyone to see. The very depth measurements that diffuse the alarm, the ones that prove these quakes are not a connected chain, come straight from those public agency feeds. If someone wanted to hide the danger, they would not be broadcasting the exact numbers that let independent people take the scary story apart. The transparency is the opposite of a cover-up. The data that calms you down is the same data they put out immediately. That is not what suppression looks like. That is what disclosure looks like. And then there is the fourth family of theories, the ones that reach outside the Earth entirely. That the timing of these quakes is driven by planetary alignments, or by solar activity, or by some human technology beaming energy into the ground. These ideas circulate widely online every time the map lights up, and I want to treat them the way this channel always does, which is honestly. Explore them, then hold them against the physics, and the physics does not cooperate. There is no established mechanism by which a distant planet's gravity, which is unimaginably feeble at this range, meaningfully changes the timing of a subduction earthquake. The energy is not there, and the geometry does not work. The same goes for the idea that solar storms or ground-based technology are pulling the trigger. The forces involved are orders of magnitude too small to overcome the colossal stresses stored in a plate boundary moving at 24 centimeters a year. These theories persist not because the evidence supports them, but because they offer something the true answer withholds. They offer a cause. They offer a hand on the lever. And the real explanation, a boundary so loaded it produces meaningless clusters by chance, refuses to give us that hand, and that refusal is genuinely hard to sit with. I want to be fair to the external forcing family, though, because there is a grain of real science near it that makes it feel more plausible than it is. Scientists have genuinely studied whether the tides, the same lunar and solar pull that moves the oceans, can influence the timing of earthquakes, and in some specific settings, researchers have found a weak statistical nudge, a very slight tendency for certain faults to be marginally more likely to slip at particular points in the tidal cycle when the tidal stress happens to add to the stress already on the fault. So the idea that the sky can touch the ground is not pure fantasy. But look carefully at what that research actually shows. The effect is tiny, detectable only across huge numbers of earthquakes as a faint statistical lean, and it only ever acts as a feather on the scale of a fault that was already essentially ready to go. It does not schedule earthquakes. It does not create them. And the tidal force from the moon and sun is vastly larger than the gravitational tug of any planet. So if even the tides can manage only a faint statistical whisper, the pull of a distant planet thousands of times weaker still is effectively nothing. The physics allows a whisper and no more, and a whisper cannot marshal 6 earthquakes into a line and aim them at a country. That is the pattern with all of these ideas. Each one takes a real phenomenon, tides, solar activity, stress transfer, and inflates it far beyond what the physics can support until a feather becomes a hand on a lever. The honest version keeps the feather a feather, because that is what unites every one of these theories, and it is worth saying out loud. Each one is a way of refusing to accept coincidence. Connected chain, foreshock warning, hidden cover-up, cosmic trigger, they are all attempts to install meaning where the honest answer is that a very active boundary did a very ordinary thing that happened to look dramatic. The theories are not really about geology. They are about our need for the world to be legible, for patterns to have authors, for danger to come with a warning we can decode. And the deepest, most uncomfortable truth of this whole subject is that the danger here is real, and the warning is not decodable, and those two facts have to be held at the same time. So let me hold them at the same time for you, plainly, because this is the honest position, and it is the one this channel will always land on. This cluster is not a coded message. It is not a countdown, not a suppressed warning, not the fingerprint of some external force. It is noise from a boundary that never stops making noise. And also, at the very same time, the danger loaded into this boundary and the faults connected to it is enormous and completely real and indifferent to whether we ever manage to read a warning in the dots. Both things are true. The cluster means nothing, and the threat means everything, and learning to hold both without collapsing into either false panic or false comfort is the whole skill. which leaves one last thing to face, the thing underneath all of it. The reason I made this video at all when the answer to the headline question is no. Because if this cluster is not the danger, you might fairly ask why we should care about it at all. And the answer is the most important thing I will say tonight. It is not about these 6 earthquakes. It is about what they are a small, harmless preview of. Because someday, on this exact boundary, one of these will not stop at magnitude 5.6. Part 12. The one that won't stop at 5.6. Every one of those 6 earthquakes released energy. Energy that had been building silently for years as the Pacific plate ground its way downward against the Australian plate. And that is the thing to hold on to because it reframes the entire cluster. These were not random hiccups. They were the boundary letting out pressure that had been accumulating the whole time, in small controlled bursts, each one a little release valve venting a fraction of the immense strain stored in the rock. On a boundary moving at 24 centimeters a year, that strain never stops building, which means the releases never stop coming. Now sit with the arithmetic of that, because it leads somewhere inevitable. If this boundary is constantly loading, and it releases that load through earthquakes, then over the long run it has to release as much energy as it stores, and it does not store it evenly, and it does not release it evenly. Most of the time it vents in these moderate quakes, the 4s and 5s that no one feels. But every so often, the strain does not release in a small burst. It releases all at once, in a single great rupture. This trench regularly tops magnitude 8. We know that. It is written in the history of the boundary. So the certainty is not whether a great earthquake comes from this system. The certainty is that it does, repeatedly, on a timescale of decades. The only thing hidden from us is the exact when. That is why I made this video. Even though the honest answer to the headline is no, this cluster will not trigger a disaster in New Zealand. Because these 6 moderate quakes, harmless as they were, are a small and faithful preview of a mechanism that will, someday, produce one that is not moderate at all. Someday, on this exact stretch of trench, an earthquake will start the same way these did, a slip on the boundary, and it will not stop at magnitude 5.6. It will keep going, and rupture a vast length of the fault, and release the energy of 10,000 of these little ones at once. That is not speculation. That is the settled behavior of the fastest, most violent plate boundary on Earth. The cluster is not the event. The cluster is the boundary reminding us in miniature of what it is capable of at full scale. There is a clean physical picture behind this, and it has a name too. It is called elastic rebound, and it was worked out more than a century ago after the Great San Francisco earthquake. Imagine bending a stick slowly. It stores the energy of your bending, holding it, until it snaps back all at once, releasing everything in an instant. A locked fault does the same thing. The plates keep moving, the rock along the fault bends and stores elastic energy, year after year, decade after decade, and when the fault finally slips, it rebounds, releasing all that stored energy as an earthquake. The bigger the patch that lets go at once and the longer it had been storing, the larger the quake. That is why a boundary moving at 24 centimeters a year is so dangerous. It is bending the stick faster than almost anywhere on Earth, which means it is storing energy toward the next snap at a ferocious rate. Scientists measure the true size of an earthquake not by the shaking alone, but by something called seismic moment, which combines how much the fault slipped, over how large an area, in how strong a rock. And seismic moment is what the magnitude scale is really tracking, which is why each step up the scale represents such a staggering jump in energy. Those 6 moderate quakes released a genuinely trivial amount of the total moment stored in this boundary, a fraction of a fraction. The overwhelming majority of the strain accumulating on the Tonga Kermadec system right now is not being released by clusters like this at all. It is being stored, quietly, for the eventual great rupture that will release in minutes what these little quakes could not release in 1,000 years of chattering. The small ones are not draining the danger, they are barely touching it. And this is where the difference between panic and awareness really matters, because they are not the same thing, and this channel has always tried to sell you the second one and never the first. Panic says the big one is coming next week because of these 6 quakes, and panic is wrong, because nothing about these quakes tells us that. Awareness says the big one is coming eventually because that is what this boundary does, and awareness is simply correct. Panic burns out. You cannot stay terrified of an earthquake map forever, and when the cluster fades and nothing happens, panic curdles into the opposite mistake. The shrug, the sense that it was all overblown and none of it matters. Awareness does not burn out, because it was never pinned to this week's dots in the first place. Awareness knows the danger is permanent and acts accordingly, on the calm days as much as the loud ones. And this is the deep reason the great earthquake will come without a readable warning, tied directly to everything we have said. If the boundary vents most of its strain in a steady rain of small and moderate quakes, and stores the rest for the eventual giant, then the small quakes are not a countdown toward the giant. They are the boundary's ordinary metabolism, running the same whether the giant is a year away or 50 years away. The strain that will power the next magnitude 8 is being stored silently, on the locked patches that are not slipping, not on the noisy patches that keep producing the 4s and 5s. The very quiet of a locked patch is what makes it dangerous, and quiet does not show up on a map as anything at all. That is the cruel geometry of it. The parts of the boundary you can see lighting up are the parts releasing pressure harmlessly. The part that will kill is the part that shows you nothing, right up until the moment it moves. So what does awareness actually ask of you, if not to watch the map? It asks the boring, life-saving things. It asks whether the building you live and work in was made to move with the ground. It asks whether your community has a plan, whether you know what to do in the first 30 seconds of hard shaking, whether the systems around you were designed by people who took the great earthquake seriously. None of that depends on predicting the day. All of it works no matter when the rupture comes. And that is the final proof that the cluster was the wrong thing to fixate on, because everything that would actually protect a person from this boundary is completely indifferent to whether 6 quakes lined up on a map this week or not. There is something almost humbling in that, when you really take it in. We are standing next to one of the most powerful natural engines on the planet, a machine dragging an ocean floor into the mantle, storing up the energy for magnitude 8 earthquakes as casually as it breathes, and the map lit up and everyone leaned in, hunting for the signal, the warning, the pattern that would tell us when. And the boundary does not deal in warnings we can read. It deals in certainty without schedule. It will produce the great earthquake. It will not tell us when. And the only sane response to certainty without schedule is not to refresh the map. It is to be ready, always, and then to live. That is really the whole of it, for New Zealand and for anyone living on the edge of a subduction zone anywhere on Earth. But I want to widen the lens for a moment before we close, because the Tonga Kermadec boundary is not alone. It is one segment of something far larger, a system that wraps the entire Pacific, and this same week, this same summer, another part of that same great ring gave us a demonstration of what a genuine giant looks like, on a scale that makes our 6 quakes look like nothing at all, and it is still unfolding right now. Part 13, A Ring That Never Rests. The Tonga Kermadec boundary is one link in a chain that circles the entire Pacific Ocean. The Ring of Fire is not a metaphor. It is a nearly continuous belt of subduction zones and volcanic arcs that runs up the western edge of South and North America, across the top through Alaska and Kamchatka, and down through Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and back around through the Southwest Pacific to exactly where our 6 earthquakes lit up. Roughly the great majority of the world's largest earthquakes, and a huge share of its volcanic eruptions happen along this ring. So when you look at the Kermadec cluster, you are not looking at an isolated event. You're looking at one small flicker on a loop of fire that is active, somewhere along its length, essentially all the time. The numbers on the ring are staggering when you say them plainly. Something like 90% of the world's earthquakes, and the large majority of its most powerful ones, happen along this belt. A huge share of the planet's active volcanoes, by many counts around 3/4 of them, stand on it. It is the single most geologically violent feature on the surface of the Earth, a nearly unbroken circle of collision and fire tens of thousands of kilometers around, and every coastline that faces the Pacific, from Chile to California to Alaska to Japan to New Zealand, lives on some part of its edge. Hundreds of millions of people sleep every night within reach of it. And that reframes the cluster one more time, in a way I think is clarifying rather than frightening. If the whole ring is always active, then on any given week, somewhere on it, dots are lighting up. Somewhere a trench is producing its moderate background quakes. Somewhere a volcano is venting. The Kermadec lineup felt singular because we were looking at that one spot, but zoom out to the whole ring, and it is simply one region's turn to be visible, on a boundary that takes its turn constantly. The ring does not rest. and neither does any major segment of it, including this one. To see what the ring is truly capable of, though, you do not look at a cluster of fives. You look at what it does when it decides to release everything at once, and this very summer another part of the ring gave us that demonstration. Up in the far north, in Kamchatka, the same belt produced a genuinely great earthquake, a magnitude 8.8, back in July of 2025. Hold that number against our week. Magnitude 8.8 is not in the same universe as magnitude 5.6. Remember that the scale is logarithmic, that each whole step is around 32 times more energy. And 8.8 is releasing on the order of tens of thousands of times the energy of the quakes that made everyone nervous this week. That is what a real giant looks like on the Ring of Fire. Not a tidy line of moderate dots, but a single rupture so vast it reshapes the region around it and rings the whole planet. To really feel where a magnitude 8.8 sits, put it alongside the giants the Ring of Fire has produced in the modern record. The largest earthquake ever recorded was the 1960 Chile earthquake, a magnitude around 9.5 on the subduction zone off South America, one link of this same ring. In 2004, the Sumatra earthquake off Indonesia, a magnitude around 9.1, another link of the ring, generated the Indian Ocean tsunami that killed well over 200,000 people, one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern history. In 2011, the Tohoku earthquake off Japan, a magnitude 9.1, again on the ring, produced the tsunami that overwhelmed the Fukushima nuclear plant. Every one of those was a subduction megathrust, the same fundamental machine as the Tonga Kermadec boundary, just a different segment of the same vast loop. That is the company this boundary keeps. That is the class of event it is built to produce. And notice the contrast, because it is the whole point. The event people got frightened by, the Kermadec cluster, was the ring at its quietest and most routine background noise dressed up by a map. The event that genuinely earned fear, the Kamchatka giant, was the ring at full power. If you want to calibrate your alarm correctly, that is the comparison to keep. A moderate cluster is the ring breathing. A magnitude 8.8 is the ring roaring. Confusing the two, treating the breath like the roar, is exactly the mistake this entire video has been trying to correct. But here is what makes the Kamchatka story more than just a yardstick for scale, and why it is worth your attention long after our 6 quakes have faded from the map. When a subduction boundary produces a great earthquake, the story often does not end with the shaking. Because that same region, Kamchatka, is one of the most volcanically loaded stretches of the entire ring, and one of its most dangerous volcanoes has been doing something that keeps raising a very specific and uncomfortable question. The Shivluch volcano has been erupting, and the way it has been behaving keeps forcing the same comparison to what that volcano did once before, in 2023 when it collapsed. And that matters far beyond Kamchatka, in a way that hits close to home for a lot of people watching this. Because when a volcano like that lets go on that scale, the effects do not stay local. They travel. Ash crosses oceans. Air corridors shut down. The North Pacific becomes a very different place for a while, and the reach of it extends toward the far side of the ring, toward the coasts of North America, toward places like the Pacific Northwest and the coast of Canada. So the question of whether Shivluch is building toward a repeat of 2023 is not an abstract one for the people who live downwind of the ring. It is the kind of question that starts out feeling like it belongs to someone else, on the far side of the world, and then quietly turns out to belong to you. So we end where we began, with the honest shape of all of it. The 6 earthquakes off New Zealand were the ring breathing, and they warned of nothing, and they will hurt no one. But the boundary they came from is one of the most violent on Earth, and the ring it belongs to is capable of true giants, and the danger woven through all of it is permanent and real and indifferent to our need for a warning. That is the tension this channel exists to sit inside. Not panic, not comfort. Clear eyes on a planet that is always, somewhere, awake. Part 14. What we're watching. So let me answer the question I opened with, cleanly, now that you have everything you need to weigh it yourself. Will this trigger a disaster in New Zealand? Based on everything we know as of today, the answer is no. The 6 earthquakes were not a connected chain, because their depths make that impossible. They were not aftershocks of the March event, because that quake was far too deep and too distant to parent them. They were not a readable warning, because no science exists that can read a warning out of a cluster like this, and they cannot trigger the Alpine Fault or the Hikurangi Zone, because the mechanisms that would let a distant moderate quake reach across an ocean simply do not operate at these magnitudes and these distances. Every road from this cluster to a New Zealand catastrophe is a dead end. That is the honest verdict, and I am not going to dress it up as anything scarier than it is. But you already know the sentence that has to follow, because we have built to it all night. New Zealand's real risk is bigger than this cluster, and it always was. It lives on the country's own faults, the Hikurangi zone offshore of the North Island and the Alpine fault down the spine of the south, and it is a matter of when, not if. That risk did not rise this week, and it will not fall when the map goes quiet. It sits there, patient, at 75% within 50 years for the Alpine fault, driven by 3 centuries of its own strain, needing nothing from the Kermadec Trench. The cluster was a bright light out at sea that pulled every eye offshore. The thing that will actually matter was underfoot the entire time, and that is the strange gift of a week like this, if you let it be one. A harmless cluster gave us a reason to look closely at a boundary most people have never heard of, and in looking closely we found not a countdown but a truth. This is the fastest, most violent plate boundary on Earth, and in a sense the title was right. It did light up, it did put on a show. But it never sleeps. It cannot. At 24 centimetres a year there is no rest in it, and the show was just a moment when its constant grinding happened to become visible to us. The waking was in our noticing. The boundary was awake the whole time, and it will still be awake long after this cluster is forgotten. If you take one thing from tonight, let it be this reframing, because it will serve you every time a map lights up and a headline tells you to be afraid. The drama on the surface, the cluster, the lineup, the count, is almost never where the real danger lives. The real danger is the slow, invisible, permanent thing underneath, the strain accumulating on a locked fault, the building that was never retrofitted, the plan that was never made. Those things do not trend. They do not spike on a map. They just sit there, quietly deciding how a future disaster will go, while everyone's eyes are pulled toward the flashing dots that decide nothing. Learning to look past the flash to the thing underneath is not just how you understand this earthquake cluster. It is how you understand almost every natural hazard you will ever hear about. I will keep watching it, and I will keep you updated as this boundary does what it does, because the next thing it produces might be another forgettable fade back into the background, or it might someday be the one that does not stop at magnitude 5.6. Nobody can tell you which, and anyone who claims they can is selling you a certainty that does not exist. What I can tell you is that this same summer, the same great ring of fire that our 6 quakes belong to has been doing something further north that may not stay contained to its own corner of the world. Up in Kamchatka, the Shiveluch volcano has been erupting in a way that keeps forcing one question, and it is waiting for you on the end screen right now. Because in 2023 that volcano collapsed, and the way it is behaving now keeps asking whether we are watching a repeat of that collapse begin, on a stretch of the ring whose ash can cross an entire ocean and reach the coasts of North America. So here is the thing I want to leave you turning over as you go. If a lineup of dots on a map cannot warn us about the danger that is real, then what is the far quieter, far less dramatic signal we should have been watching instead, on the volcano whose next move might reach all the way to the other side of the world?